I don't know if this really belongs here, but it's something I've never been able to explain. I've been camping since I was a kid. My dad used to take me every summer, so being alone in the woods has never really bothered me. I know the sounds animals make at night, and I don't usually get nervous over little things. This happened about 3 years ago. I drove to a national forest a few hours from my house for a weekend trip. It wasn't a completely remote area. There were a handful of campsites scattered along the road, but by the time I got there, most of them were empty. It was late September, so camping season was pretty much over. I picked a site near the end of the campground because it was quieter. There was one occupied campsite about 100 yards away, but I never saw the people staying there. While I was unloading my truck, I noticed a man walking through the trees. He wasn't on the road or on one of the trails. He was just walking between the trees at a slow pace. I remember thinking it was a little strange, but not enough to worry about. Some people like exploring off the trail. We made eye contact for a second. He gave me a quick wave. I waved back and went back to setting up my tent. That was the only time I saw him that day. That night was quiet. I went to sleep around 11. Sometime before sunrise, I woke up because I thought I heard someone walking nearby. I stayed still for a few seconds, listening. The footsteps didn't sound rushed. They were slow and steady. After a minute or so, they stopped. I figured it was probably another camper heading to the restroom, or maybe someone walking their dog early in the morning. I eventually went back to sleep. The next morning, I stepped outside my tent and noticed footprints in the dirt. They were boot prints. They circled my tent. At first, I honestly didn't think much of it. It annoyed me more than anything. I figured somebody had wandered through my campsite during the night. I made breakfast, packed a small backpack, and spent most of the day hiking. Around lunchtime, I stopped by the campground entrance to refill my water bottle. The same man was there. He was sitting alone at one of the picnic tables. As I walked past him, he smiled and asked, "Sleep all right?" I said, "Yeah." Then he said something that caught me off guard. "I didn't think you were ever going to come out." I laughed because I assumed he was joking. He didn't laugh back. He just nodded once and looked away. For some reason, that conversation stayed with me the rest of the day. Not because of what he said, because of how he said it. It sounded like he had been watching my campsite. I travel for work almost every week. Most of the time it's nothing exciting. I drive, stay in whatever cheap motel the company books for me, finish the job, and head home. About 2 years ago, I was going through a divorce and I wasn't sleeping much. Some nights I'd get 2 or 3 hours if I was lucky. My doctor kept telling me I needed to slow down, but taking time off wasn't really an option. I remember him saying that sleep deprivation could make people hear or see things that weren't there. At the time, I thought he was exaggerating. One Tuesday night, I checked into a small roadside motel somewhere in western Nebraska. It wasn't dirty. It was just old. The kind of place where every room looked exactly the same, and the carpet had probably been there since the 90s. The woman at the front desk handed me my key and apologized because they only had one room left. I didn't care. I was exhausted. I grabbed some fast food, answered a few emails, watched TV for maybe 20 minutes, and went to bed. I woke up sometime during the night because someone knocked on my door. It wasn't loud, just 3 slow knocks. I looked at the clock. 3:14 a.m. I stayed in bed for a few seconds, expecting whoever it was to knock again. They never did. I figured someone had the wrong room. I rolled over and went back to sleep. The next morning, there was nothing outside my door. No note, no room service tray, nothing. I checked out, finished my job, and didn't think about it again. A week later, I was sent back to the same town. The company booked the same motel. I actually laughed when I realized it. The woman at the front desk recognized me. She smiled, handed me the key, and said, "Back again?" I told her hopefully, just for one night. She laughed. That was the entire conversation. That night, I went to bed around 11. At exactly 3:14, I woke up again. 3 slow knocks. This time, I got out of bed. I looked through the peephole. The hallway was empty. I opened the door a few seconds later. Still nobody. The hallway lights were on. There wasn't a single person in either direction. I remember standing there thinking, maybe I was more tired than I realized. My doctor had warned me about sleep deprivation. Maybe this was what he meant. The next morning, I stopped at a gas station before heading to work. One of the guys I was working with asked why I looked so tired. I joked that I was starting to lose my mind because someone kept knocking on my motel door in the middle of the night. He laughed. "It's probably the pipes," he said. "Old buildings make weird noises." Honestly, that explanation made sense. I stopped thinking about it. Until I had to stay there a third time. I checked in just before 7 that evening. The woman at the front desk recognized me again. She smiled, handed me my room key, and asked how work had been going. I told her it had been a long week. Before I walked away, I asked her something. "Do people ever complain about hearing knocks at night?" She looked at me for a second. Then she shrugged. "It's an old building." That was all she said. I went to my room, ordered takeout, answered a few emails, and tried to stay awake longer than usual. I kept telling myself that if I was awake at 3:14, I'd finally find out what was making the noise. Around 1 in the morning, I was still watching TV. By 2, I was struggling to keep my eyes open. The next thing I remember was waking up to someone knocking. I looked at the clock. 3:14. Exactly. 3 slow knocks. I sat up immediately. This time I didn't move toward the door. I just listened. Nothing. No footsteps, no voices, no doors opening or closing. Just silence. After about 30 seconds, I walked over and looked through the peephole. The hallway was empty again. I don't know why, but I decided to stay awake. I turned the TV off and sat in the chair by the window for almost an hour. Nobody walked past my room. Nobody made a sound. The next morning, I packed my things and headed to the office. I mentioned it to one of the guys I worked with again. He laughed and asked if I was finally going to listen to my doctor. I laughed too. At that point, I honestly believed I was just exhausted. A few weeks later, I finished that project and never went back to that motel. Life moved on. I slept better. The knocking stopped. Eventually, I forgot about it. Until almost 6 months later, I got a phone call from a detective in Nebraska. At first, I thought it was some kind of scam. He asked if I had stayed at the Pine Ridge Motel several times the previous fall. I told him I had. Then he asked for my room number. I couldn't remember. He said, "Would it have been room 214? It was. He asked me one more question. "Did you ever open the door after you heard knocking?" I told him no. There was a long pause. Then he said, "That's probably why you're talking to me today." The detective asked if I had a few minutes to answer some questions. I said yes. He told me they had recently arrested a man a few counties away. At first, they thought he was breaking into storage units. He wasn't. He had been sneaking into motels, not to steal, not to attack anyone. He would just walk the hallways late at night and try door handles until he found one that was unlocked. If the door was locked, he'd knock a few times. If nobody answered, he'd move on. If someone opened the door, he'd make up an excuse. Wrong room. Looking for a friend. Too much to drink. Anything to end the conversation. The detective said they still didn't know why he was doing it. The man refused to talk after he was arrested. I asked what any of that had to do with me. There was another pause. Then the detective said, "When we searched his house, we found notebooks." He explained that there were several of them. Every page had dates, motel names, room numbers, and short notes. Nothing detailed, just enough to remind him of each room. The detective asked me again if I was sure I had never opened the door. I told him I was positive. He said, "That's good." Then he read something from one of the notebooks. October 12th, Pine Ridge Motel, room 214. Another short pause. Then he continued. 3 knocks. Occupant awake. Door stayed closed. That was it. No name, no description, just one sentence. I asked how the man could have known I was awake if I never answered the door. The detective said they had been asking themselves the same question. Apparently, in several of the motel hallways where this happened, there were security cameras. The footage showed the suspect knocking, then standing completely still for a few seconds, sometimes almost a full minute, as if he was listening. The detective believed he was trying to hear movement inside the room, breathing, footsteps, a television turning on, anything that told him someone was awake. Before we hung up, I asked him one last question. Did he ever hurt anyone? The detective took a second before answering. Then he said, "Not that we can prove." Those were the exact words he used. Not that we can prove. I looked the motel up a few months later. It had closed down. I don't know what happened to the building after that. I don't know what happened to the man either. But I still wake up sometimes when I hear knocking at a hotel room. And no matter what time it is, I always check the clock first. I bought my first house when I was 29. It wasn't anything special, just a small 2-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood outside Indianapolis. The previous owner was an older man who had lived there for over 30 years before moving into assisted living. The inspection came back clean, and I moved in about a week later. For the first month, everything was normal. Then little things started happening. Nothing serious. I'd leave a kitchen cabinet open without remembering it. A light I'd swear I turned off would be on when I got home. Once I found the back door unlocked. I convinced myself I was just distracted. Moving into a new house is stressful, and I figured I simply wasn't paying attention. A few weeks later, I bought a security camera for the front door. Not because I thought someone was breaking in, mostly because packages kept getting delivered while I was at work. The camera never recorded anything unusual. No strangers, no one trying the door, nothing. I stopped thinking about it. Then my neighbor mentioned something that stuck with me. He asked if my brother had moved in. I told him I didn't have a brother. He looked confused. He said he'd seen a man leaving my house one afternoon while I was at work. He assumed we were related because the guy used a key instead of knocking. I laughed and told him he must have seen someone at the wrong house. He apologized, but he looked pretty sure of himself. That night, I checked every room. Every window was locked. Nothing was missing. I even checked the attic. There was nothing up there except insulation and a few old boxes left by the previous owner. A couple of days later, I called the locksmith who had changed my front door lock after I moved in. I asked him if there was any chance someone else still had a working key. He told me no. The lock had been completely replaced. There shouldn't have been another key anywhere. That answer should have made me feel better. It didn't. About a month later, I came home early because I wasn't feeling well. As I pulled into my driveway, I noticed my trash can had been moved. I figured the wind had knocked it over. When I got inside, everything looked normal. I went to the kitchen to grab some water. That's when I noticed a coffee mug sitting in the sink. I hadn't used that mug in weeks. It was still warm. I actually remember touching it twice because I couldn't believe it. I searched the entire house. Closets, garage, attic, every room. Nobody was there. I called the police anyway. 2 officers showed up about 20 minutes later. They searched the house again. Nothing. One of them asked if maybe I'd made coffee before work and forgotten about it. I almost agreed with him, until the other officer walked into the kitchen. He looked at the mug. Then he looked at me. He asked, "When did you say you got home?" I told him. He nodded toward the coffee maker. The light was still on. The pot was half full. Someone had made coffee less than an hour earlier. The officers searched outside. One of them found fresh footprints leading through the woods behind my backyard. They disappeared after about 50 yards. I changed every lock in the house that same week. A few days later, the locksmith called me. He said he'd figured out what happened. When he replaced my front door lock, he never changed the lock on the side garage door. Both doors led into the house. Someone had been using the old owner's spare key the entire time. They never found out who it was. My neighbor never saw the man again. Neither did I. I sold the house the following year. The strangest part is something the officer told me before he left. He said, "Whoever it was knew your schedule. I don't think they expected you to come home early."